Let's move on to the next type of relationship, which will create all kinds of interesting dynamics and challenges for people of all age groups, really, which is the one of child and parent and vice versa. I'll just let you sort of dive right into that one.
So someone said to me, there's only two people in your life that have a hotline to your kishkas, your hotline to your innards, that can really push your buttons, and that's your parents. That's the nature of parent-child relationships. It's fraught. I just want to say, just from a Jewish perspective, because I think it's important just in terms of giving a context to parent-child relationships, and that is the Talmud quotes Abaya. Abaya was one of the famous Talmudic teachers, and he was an orphan. He had no parents. And he says about himself how fortunate he is. Of course, it's very difficult not to have parents to live as an orphan. But he says that there's an aspect of a silver lining here, that he doesn't have the challenge of honoring his parents, because one can never really fulfill properly their obligation of honoring and respecting their parents. And I think that's the real biggest challenge. Judaism puts a huge emphasis. I mean, it's one of the Ten Commandments. Huge emphasis on honoring and respecting one's parents, and this really is where the challenge is. Often, children, especially this generation, seems to be particularly sensitive. I can't complain because this is a source of many of my clients. But there are often challenges of parents and children often blame their parents. When most people are coming into therapy, it's blaming their parents for some misdemeanor or some way that they were treated over a long period of time, and then some traumatic childhood. Again, I'm not negating that, but I'm just saying that that is a bit of a challenge in terms of blaming parents, and at the same time maintaining an honor and a respect for who they are.
Can I just ask, before you continue, can I just ask, why is it that parents have this power to really, as you said, get into people, really touch a nerve and push all the wrong buttons in their children?
No, so I was just saying, in our formative years, growing up from the age of 0 to 8 to 10, our parents were the most powerful people in our lives. They held the purse strings, and they made the decisions about what we could eat, what we couldn't eat, where we could go, what we could do. They were omnipotent, so to speak, in our lives, and therefore we seek their approval. Children are hardwired to seek their parents' approval, and that never really goes away. You have the 40 or 50-year-old businessman that still is trying to get his mother's approval. That's the nature of. So whenever there's a potential disappointment, or there's criticism, or there's judgment, or there's perceived withdrawal of love, it's going to impact so much more a child than it would be someone else.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I thought maybe it could be more the fact that, as you say, you see them as being omnipotent and being totally, right about everything, and then you grow up and then you start to feel like, oh, well, that thing you do irritates me, or that I don't like, or that, and I thought the irritation comes more from like, I thought you were this, but I thought you were perfect, but now I see some level of imperfection. And that's like very hard to swallow. Could that be part of it?
That's definitely there. There's no question that the dynamic that takes place is that as a child becomes older, and it's the real challenge actually of teenager, and it's often a source of rebellion, because a teenager suddenly realizes that his parents are not necessarily right, and they're not perfect, and they look around and they see other people and how they would do it, and will be a better way of doing it. So yeah, no question, starting to see the imperfection of parents is something, but that doesn't explain why it is that we feel so, why we're so attached to our parents, why what they think about us, their perception of us, and their approval of us, and their withdrawal of love or not, and has such an impact on us. Why it's so important. It's so important because of the role they play in our lives, the formative role they played in our lives. So the truth is, there are books, there's whole libraries of books. Child relationship is fraught with challenge. It's very rare that there is a relationship between parents and children. And of course, when we contrast it to, say, friendship, you don't choose your parents, and the parents don't choose their children. Parents have enormous expectations of their children. There are often, especially if someone's not worked out yet and hasn't worked through their issues, it could be massive triggers for their own insecurities and their own failings in life, viewing their children as the lack of success of their children as a lack of their own success. There are many ways that parent-child relationship can become enmeshed, as we call it.
Absolutely. So what would you say are some of the pointers that people can take on in order to get the best out of those relationships?
I would say it's a key in any relationship, but particularly parent-child relationship, because it's so fraught with challenge, is an ability to sort of to take things on the chin, to be not so sensitive, and to be able to overlook, whether it's criticism, whether it's perceived judgments, whether it's a comment that might have upset. Sensitivity in any relationship, but particularly in parent-child relationship, isn't going to bode well. Because humans are infallible, and there are often things that we can do that our children or our parents perceive as a negative, and they weren't intended to be like that. It's a challenge of all human relationships. Being too sensitive, I would say, is a common theme in a breakdown of relationships, and particularly parent-child relationships.
But is that
an ability to sort of
is that, some would argue that that's saying, like, don't expect too much from this relationship, from a parent-child relationship. Hold back some of your sensitivity, meaning don't get that people could interpret that as, don't get too close. In other words, you're saying don't have such high expectations. I feel like some people might want to say, no, that's wrong. That's not how it should be.
I'm not saying don't have too high expectations. I'm saying in a dynamic, a phone call, something was said, there was an intonation, or there was something that was done that wasn't appreciated, whatever it may be, just to sort of let it go. Sort of be the bigger person, whether you're as a parent or whether as a child, just to sort of let things go and not to be too sensitive.
And how do you ensure that doesn't lead to how do you ensure that doesn't lead to resentment building up?
It's a good point. It's a good point. I think if people are able to see the perspective, I said that there is a difference between being a bigger person and letting it go, and really feeling it and it bothering you, and you don't do anything about it, and then you let it build up. In other words, a person knows if they're just biting the bullet and swallowing it and really upset about it and seething, or if they're able to see the bigger picture and realize that this person is someone who I love, someone who I care about, and okay, they made a mistake. They said something that hurt me. They didn't realize they hurt me. They didn't intend to do it, and I'm going to be the bigger person. We know. In other words, you're right. It looks the same, but in terms of qualitatively, it's very different. And listen, don't get me wrong. This is a very difficult quality to develop. There's a greatness to it, to be a bigger person and to be able to be above, almost go above pettiness. But I really feel that this is the oil that lubricates a healthy relationship, particularly with parent-child, when there's so much at stake and it's so fraught with challenge. Is just to be able to step above that and not taken in by that, not to be petty.
It's so funny that these things, they seem so I'm sure they'll seem so self-evident to a lot of people, and yet many people, they battle huge amounts in this particular relationship in this area, because it's almost like we were saying at the beginning. It would be so much more helpful if life handed a manual to you that sort of made you aware of these things, so that people wouldn't naturally fall into these pitfalls. I wonder then, how do you understand the Torah's emphasis on respecting one's parents, and how does that play into all of what you've just said?
I mean, there is so much of an emphasis on it. It's not just in the Ten Commandments. Throughout the Talmudic literature, honoring parents is seen as one of the greatest things that a person can do. And many illustrations of this. We don't have to, beyond the scope of this discussion, but there are Talmudic illustrations. Even if a parent was to come up to someone and hit them, they should just accept it. I think simply speaking, it's hard to put a perspective on parental relationships and on honoring parents as just I don't know. I don't know. It's a I don't know about in terms of the balance between honoring parents and respecting them, and at the same time dealing with issues that might come up with parents. It's one of the reasons why it's a bit difficult for me to answer. I have in my therapy room, I have in my private practice, I have people that come in, like I said, primarily the source of their issues are about blaming parents and issues that have happened growing up, things that their parents have done, and they find it almost impossible to honor their parents, to respect their parents, especially if abuse has gone on. So that's a real question. I would say it's something for a spiritual mentor to discuss about how there's a fine line between when one can and has to, and how one respects parents that, let's say, are abusive or neglectful. But I just want to emphasize that the Torah does put a huge emphasis on how that dovetails and synthesizes with abuse and neglect, and is not an easy thing to answer.
Absolutely. And I mean, as you say, certainly in the Talmud, it talks about scenarios where you do have actually abusive parents, and yet some of these great... Sorry?
I lost you. I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
I was just saying that the Talmud does, as you say, talk about instances of great people, great rabbinical sages that had abusive parents and yet remained sustained a level of respect that was just, remarkable. And clearly, and I think it's probably a discussion for it's probably for a separate discussion. You're right, but clearly the Torah places huge emphasis on the importance of respecting one's parents, honoring one's parents, and I think it's probably a discussion for another time. But I think we've probably dealt with the key issues around how to make the most out of that relationship and navigate the best way you can through that.
Well, just on that, just to add one point, in other words, there is a distinction between showing honor and showing respect, as opposed to a relationship. Honor and respect their parents without necessarily having a relationship. A parental relationship doesn't have to be like a friendship. It doesn't have to be where there's mutual sharing. Of course, it's important that there's trust, but it doesn't mean that parents have to be friends and parents have to be equals and everything has to be shared. One can still show honor and respect without having without a parental relationship being like a friendship.
Yeah, I personally think that a lot of it comes down to learning about, for me, one of the most central elements of Judaism, of the Torah, is gratitude. And ultimately, a huge source of, gratitude is about being recognizing the blessings you have in your life, and the greatest blessing of all is your existence. And two agents that played a huge role in your existence are your parents. And also, the more you think about the Torah doesn't allow us to ignore gratitude, even when it's complex. An example is Moses isn't allowed to smite the River Nile. It had to, and which led to the plague of blood. It had to be Aaron, because Moses was meant to have gratitude, hakaras hatov, to the River Nile for saving him when he was a baby boy. And I think that probably has a lot to do with it. It's not so much necessarily about should you have a good or a bad relationship. It's about recognizing where's the source of your existence, and I think that's why it's listed as the fifth of the first five of the Ten Commandments, which seem to be otherwise all about the relationship between man and God. In other words, it's about focusing on the source of your existence, on why you should, on gratitude. And I think it's there to sort of, this commandment is very much about your relationship with God, actually, and building gratitude there and focusing on recognizing the source of your creation, I think.
Yeah, definitely a very fair point. Very fair point. In fact, just talking about that is that gratitude. What's interesting is you mentioned before about Moses smiting the river. Is that of course the question is the river's not going to take any notice. The river is not a conscious being and not aware of this. Gratitude is not, as people think, that it's a quality of man to man, but rather the characteristics of a human being, the characteristics the person has to develop through his journey in life. There's a third category. It's not there's between man and God, and man and oneself. And gratitude, in fact, is really between a quality between man and oneself. In other words, a level of human sensitivity, gratitude. This attitude of being grateful, and you're right. In the word, a spiritual healthy person is someone who has a developed attitude of gratitude, because really gratitude comes from an ability to notice positive things in one's life. if you don't have that highly attuned, conscious sensitivity to what's positive in your life, then you don't open yourself up to blessing or to appreciation. And on a deeper level, it's when a person has gratitude, it flexes the muscles of him being grateful to God, and therefore it fuels his drive and his spiritual endeavors to become a greater human being.
Definitely. To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.